Hey, so my name is Jeff Bale. I'm an associate professor of language and literacy education here in the Department of Curriculum Teaching and Learning. I've been in OISE for 5 years now. I finished my PhD in 2008. So I went to Arizona State University and worked in a department that focuses on educational policy. And within that program, they had an applied linguistics program on language policy, which is what I studied.
So would you please also tell us about your recent research projects?
Sure, there are two main ones that I run here, and I'm a co-PI on a third one that's based in Winnipeg. But one is a collaborative project with colleagues here in our department with Antoinette Gagné and Julie Karakash, and we're looking at mainstream teacher education that focuses on supporting English language learners. So Ontario is the only province in Canada that requires that all teacher candidates for K-12 settings, it doesn't matter what their grade level is, doesn't matter what their teaching subject is, everybody has to learn in a pre-service program about linguistic diversity in general and how to support English learners in particular, and that's a new policy phenomenon. So we are just about to start our third year of a SSHRC-funded project looking at what this policy appropriation looks like in practice through three different perspectives. One is working with English learners themselves to create language profiles, we're calling them me maps, of their linguistic and cultural identities and their academic trajectories. A second strand is looking at our program here, the teacher education program at OISE itself, and a required course in that program called Supporting English Learners, and how that is taken up by teacher candidates, by teacher educators, and in local schools. And the third strand we're just starting this year, this coming academic year, which is to do a comparative analysis of the other teacher education programs in Ontario and how they've responded to this policy mandate to include curricular work and practical work with teacher candidates learning how to support English learners. That's one project. A second project is historical in nature. It's looking at the Heritage Languages program in Ontario. It's a 40-plus-year-old education policy that supports the study of what are now called international languages, but effectively non-official languages, non-English, non-French languages in Ontario, in after-school contexts or weekend contexts. And this is a genealogy, a particular kind of historical analysis looking at how this particular language policy effectively functioned and functions as a way to regulate racial and linguistic difference in Ontario. So we're looking at how this policy really, in some ways, reflects and is the site of racialized concerns over which languages belong in school in Ontario, which don't, and who gets to decide that.
So what do you think the contributions of such research project would be to the community of knowledge in general?
Well, I would suppose that both these studies have different audiences. The first study around teacher education, obviously, it has a direct impact in terms of, hopefully at least has a direct impact in terms of teachers that are entering the workforce. Many of us who've been doing work around English language education and supporting racialized and minoritized language speakers in places like Ontario, very diverse contexts like Ontario, we've been advocating for a long time that the entire teaching force, not just ESL specialists, but the entire teaching force needs to have both theoretical, conceptual, and practical experience with supporting English learners. So we think this work will help train a next generation of teachers. But again, because this is a mandate, a policy mandate, that adds a sort of complication to how this work gets done. So we think we're going to be able to share a lot with other contexts within Canada and beyond about what this a broad project of teacher education for linguistic diversity looks like in practice. For the other project, the one on heritage languages, this is in some ways, there's two goals. One is to really reclaim stories around efforts to more radical efforts, more robust efforts to include linguistic diversity, to create programming for linguistic diversity in Ontario schools. Those efforts failed largely, but also our memory of those things is gone. And so I think this is something that Gary Kinsman writes about in terms of a structured process of forgetting. We've forgotten what these efforts and really some of the battles over them are like. So we get to reclaim those stories and bring them forward for people in the here and now learn from, because Ontario is only becoming more and more diverse linguistically. We think that has a really important contribution to make to including linguistic diversity at school now.
Okay. If you get back to your expertise, language policy, what are the current trends in the area you're working? I mean, in language policy.
Well, it's a huge field, so I wouldn't be able to talk about the field in its entirety, but I think like most of applied linguistics, language policy is wrestling with a conceptual turn to getting away from efforts to think of languages as discrete, separate items and understand languages as lived as a collective, but also processed as a collective in our mind, and what that means from a policy perspective. I think certainly this is a general argument I've made, that I think some of the politically liberal orientations of the field, meaning the idea that language policy is an objective process of identifying a social problem that has to do with language in society and solving it through policy, all the assumptions that come from that, I think the field has in many ways reached the limits of what's possible when we think that way, and is, I think, maybe struggling to figure out conceptually where it wants to go next. So one way that I guess I'll talk about this conference that we're having in August as a way to highlight some of those debates. One is one way to move the field forward is what can we learn, what can we gain from engaging seriously in Indigenous ways of knowing, and what that means for policy, for language policy in particular. And what does the whole notion of policy as a textual thing, as a norm-based thing, as a social thing mean from Indigenous ways of knowing. A second way is to consider political economy more thoroughly in terms of what do we mean by the material conditions under which policies are created and enacted. And I think particularly in a place like Canada, in addition to Indigenous perspectives on policy, taking questions of race and racism very seriously as the analytical focal point of our work. That's something that applied linguistics in general has been hesitant to do. That applies to language policy as well. We're starting to see a change in the field on that question.
Thank you. Suppose I'm a graduate student, so I'd like to know, for example, more about language policy. Where can I get a start? For example, which books, which publications shall I start first or study?
Well, that's part of some of the difficulty is there are the field's really been around as a self-defined field for, I'll say, 40 years, 35, 40 years. And one of the signs that a subdiscipline has become its own field is the presence of textbooks that try to define it. Probably the one that I think is the most suitable for graduate students is a book that David Cassels-Johnson wrote called Language Policy. And what I think David did really well is marrying his perspective on what the field really should be with a very generous read of what the field has been. So I actually use that book when I teach the course on language policy as a reference point. But there are handbooks now on language policy. There's an edited volume edited by Francis Holt and David Cassels-Johnson on methods of language policy research. So those are good overviews of what's possible in the field. I will say, and I'll say this as generously as possible, they reflect a particular take on the field that is, I think still within this sort of liberal framework of what policy does and what it could do, and that is being challenged by other perspectives in applied linguistics and the academy more generally, more broadly, and we have yet to see what a policy handbook, like a handbook on language policy research, would look like that is centered on decolonial and anti-racist perspectives. We get to see what a methods textbook would look like that is centered on decolonial and anti-racist perspectives in language policy work. So I think that's where I say I think the field is somewhat at a crossroads of not having a tradition of engaging that sort of social theory in a very thorough way, but at the same time having sort of run the limits or hit the limits of what a more traditional social science approach to language policy can do. We're sort of at that moment trying to figure that out.
Yeah, that brings us to the last question. What are some controversial issues in your research area now?
In my research of the area?
The language policy.
The broader, well, just what I've been talking about, yeah. So what, in a place like, I'll talk about Canada. So we are, I'm not sure when this video will be posted, but this is the 50th year of official bilingualism in Canada. And Eve Hawk, a colleague in our field, has written really the book I think, and making sense of what official bilingualism means in a linguistically diverse context like Canada. And our argument is that official bilingualism, on the one hand, worked to resolve one sort of tension in the Canadian state by resolving, by trying to resolve tensions between English colonialism, English chauvinism, and a Francophone minority by setting English and French languages on more equal footing. In doing that and sort of trying to resolve that tension, it exacerbated a second tension, which is the reality of a subordination of Indigenous languages and those spoken by what then were called other ethnic groups. And official bilingualism effectively solidified that hierarchical relationship between two white settler languages and the other languages present in Canada. That has not been addressed seriously intellectually in our field. This is just as a case to answer your question. And I think perspectives that center on anti-racism and perspectives that center on decoloniality challenge many of the assumptions of what language policy is, what it should do, what it can be used to do, and how it in fact regulates, in my case I care about schools the most, so how it regulates school spaces. By taking those perspectives seriously, we rethink what policy is all about.